It was the soy sauce that stopped me in my tracks. I was standing in my mother's house more than a year after she died. And every time I looked at the soy sauce, every time I looked at those cooking oils, I froze. I just couldn't get myself to throw them away. Every time I looked at them, I thought about the meals she had cooked, how much she loved feeding people, all the dishes that she would make for us. How was it possible that my mother would never cook in this kitchen again? This house, my mother's dream house, it had been my safe harbor. My mother was my anchor. I knew that no matter what happened, if I got sick, if I lost my job, if my marriage fell apart, I could always come back to her house. When my mother was alive, I had security, certainty. Of course, I could stay with her on holiday. Of course, we could leave our boxes in her attic when we moved to Europe. Of course, one day we would move back to New York to take care of her. After she died, there was no more of course. If anything, I was off course. I found myself unanchored, adrift, lost in an ocean of grief, overwhelmed by the waves of emotion that washed over me. Maybe you've experienced a loss similar to this, the loss of something that anchored you, that made you feel safe, secure, certain. When my mother died, I was living in London, and for a year, I flew back and forth across the Atlantic, trying to figure out what to do with her estate, what to do with her house. I traveled with her purse slung across my chest, on top of my purse. In her purse was her wallet and her death certificate. Why was I carrying her death certificate? I think on some level, I thought maybe I would need to prove to someone that she was really dead. Looking back, I think I was the one who didn't fully grasp that she was really gone, that she was not coming back to that dream house. I was like a lost child, waiting for mommy to come back to help me. During this terrible time of being unanchored, I found an anchor in the house. It was my safe place. I could cry or not cry, be sad, be angry, be confused, just be. And I tried to clear it out. It was very slow progress, though. I mostly found myself picking up an item, walking to another room, setting it back down. And some spaces, like her bedroom, the dining table, they stayed untouched, like a still life. And I felt safe in that house. But after a while, I started to feel the weight of being anchored to my mother's house. I started to feel heavy. I'd been paying the mortgage on this house for over a year. The bills were piling up, my savings were dwindling down. And my husband was really confused. He didn't understand why was it taking me so long to deal with the house and its contents. Just throw it all in a dumpster, he said. Yes, I considered divorce. It was my mother's dream house. How could I let it go? But I also had this recurring vision of me tethered to the house, and it was pulling me down to the bottom of the ocean. I had this vision of me stretching, gasping for air, reaching for light, and getting dragged down all the way into the darkness. I felt like I was drowning. It was time to let go of the house. Because that's the funny thing about anchors. On the one hand, an anchor can keep you safe, stable, keep you from drifting out into the open ocean, keep you from getting dashed to pieces on the rocks. And on the other hand, an anchor can keep you stuck in one place for too long, not moving forward. And that's where I was. I was stuck stuck in my dead mother's unoccupied house, far from my home, my work, my life, my husband. It was time to let go. Having decided to let go of the house, I now had a problem. Actually, hundreds of problems. And that was all of her belongings in the house. You see, after she died, all of these everyday things became precious. Everything on her shelves, everything on the surfaces, precious. That rock that she picked up on holiday in Greece, precious. That ugly bookshelf that she bought at a garage sale, precious. That McDonald's toy, my mother had picked it out. It might still have her fingerprints on it. How could I let it go? Maybe you've experienced something similar with the belonging of a loved one. Maybe it was a musical instrument that they'll never play again. A leather jacket that still smells like them. How do we choose what to keep and what to discard when we feel so attached to these objects, when they have so much meaning for us? Here's how I chose. When my mother died, I was working as an independent curator. I was working with designers and artists, and I would curate exhibitions, looking at their work and selecting the best, putting exhibitions on in galleries. And I would put them together and show it so that it showed their work in the best light, told the best story of their craft and their work and their inspirations. So as I stood in my mother's house, overwhelmed by all this responsibility, overwhelmed by all this stuff, an inspiration hit, or maybe it was out of desperation. I put on my curator hat and I asked myself, if I was to do an exhibition about my mother, which 100 objects would I choose? And that question, if I was to do an exhibition about my mother, which 100 objects would I choose? That gave me a criteria for looking at all the things in her house. That souvenir from Brazil made me smile. She loved to travel, but it was also bittersweet. She would never travel again. We would never go to Machu Picchu together. There was a pack of Oreos on top of her fridge, kind of random, but every time I looked at that box of Oreos, I felt so much shame, so much guilt, so much regret, because I had forgotten my mother's last birthday. And that package of Oreos was a special edition, a birthday edition that she had bought for herself. And every time I looked at those Oreos, shame, regret, guilt, the certainty that I was a bad daughter. And of course, there was the soy sauce that I was so attached to. And I did clear out that house. I sold the house, and 2 years after she died, I did an exhibition in London where I showed some of the objects that I kept. People asked questions about them. I told stories about my mother. It was the memorial I wanted to give her. Now, you're unlikely to actually ever do an exhibition about your loved one. You probably don't have a gallery space that you're working with. You might not be a professional curator. But even though you don't have a gallery, you probably have a bookshelf, a wall of framed photos, maybe a special place on a fireplace mantle. You are choosing every day what gets put into your space, what gets pride of place. And in this way, we are all curators. We are all making these choices about what takes up space in our homes and in our offices. And these choices matter. They take up space in our homes and in our lives and in our hearts. These objects have volume. They have weight. And physical weight, but more importantly, emotional weight. After I did that exercise of going through my mother's house and deciding, choosing with intention, what to keep and what to let go of, I felt so much lighter. I realized I had anchored myself not just to her house, but to all of those objects in her house. Hundreds of small anchors. No wonder it started to feel heavy. And each of those objects in her house, they also had things attached. They had stories, they had memories, thoughts, ideas. That bottle of soy sauce, attached to it, right? Thanksgiving dinner, the Chinese congee that she would make with the leftovers, everyday meals in her house. No wonder I'm so attached to it. But it didn't make sense to keep the soy sauce. It didn't make sense to put it in my suitcase and take it back to London with me. I didn't want to keep the soy sauce, but I wanted to keep the memories and the stories. And the beautiful thing is that I could detach the stories, attach them to something else. In this case, it was a cooking spoon from my mother's kitchen. And I attached those stories, those memories, and I took that spoon with me. And the beautiful thing is, it fit in my suitcase. And it fit in my life. It fit in the life that I wanted to live. It fit in the life I wanted to create moving forward. Remember the package of Oreo cookies? Heaviest container of cookies ever. And that makes sense too. Attached to that package of Oreos was that memory of forgetting her birthday, that belief that I was a bad daughter. I tossed the package of Oreos. And I tossed the stories that were attached in that belief. Imagine for a moment what might have happened if I decided to keep the Oreos and all those thoughts and stories and beliefs about being a bad daughter. Maybe I would be triggered every time I saw Oreos at the store. Maybe every year on my mother's birthday, I would get really depressed. Maybe I would start avoiding thinking about my mother or talking about her because I felt so much guilt. But that's not what I wanted. This weekend would have been my mother's 75th birthday. I am not depressed. I am excited to tell you about her. I bought her a slice of birthday cake, dedicated it to her, and I am celebrating her. This is what's possible when we choose with intention, when we curate. I had a lot of hard choices after my mother died. And by curating, by choosing intentionally what to keep, what to let go of, I get to move forward in the way that I want. The grief will always be with me. My mother will always be with me. But I have lightened the load. It's now easier to carry the grief and my mother with me. After you lose a loved one, you too will likely have hard choices. I invite you to choose with intention, to make those choices beautiful. I invite you to put on your curator hat. Thank you.